Good morning guys, my name's Tom Archer and today I'm going to talk to you about the best lenses for landscape photography. My name's Tom Archer, I'm a freelance photographer. I've worked for tourist boards and brands all around the world, and today I want to talk to you about what's in my camera bag, what I always have with me on the shoot and why. So let's start off with my camera. I shoot with Nikon. I mainly use the Nikon D810. It's a great camera for landscapes. It's got a very high resolution sensor. It's also got great dynamic range, which means you retain details in the shadows and the highlights. And on top of that, it's got a really good low light sensor, which means it's great for night photography. So I have three main lenses always with me that cover a whole range of focal lengths. For me, these are the most important ones for landscapes. A lot of people shoot with primes, which is a fixed focal length. For me, they're more advantageous shooting portraits or weddings. When it comes to landscapes, I'd rather have the flexibility, and you don't necessarily need that big aperture that comes with a prime lens because you can use a tripod and have slow shutter speeds. So the first lens I want to talk about is the Nikon 24-70 f2.8. This is a great all-rounder lens. It's my workhorse lens. If I was to choose one lens to have with me, it would definitely be this. It's got a really good focal length range from 24mm, which is relatively wide, all the way through to 70mm. It's very sharp, it's got great clarity and colour and contrast in it, and it's just a great all-rounder lens. Second lens I want to talk about is the Nikon 14-24mm, also f2.8. This is a super wide lens. Super wide lenses are really important in landscape photography because you often need that width to encompass the whole landscape. If you want to shoot the sky and a foreground interest, you need to be able to fit everything in. This lens is extremely sharp, which is great for landscape too. It's also very good in low light, so wider lenses generally let more light in, which makes this great for night photography. And when I'm shooting the night sky or the northern lights, I pretty much always have this lens on my camera. The final lens I want to talk about is the Nikon 70-200mm f2.8. Now this is the VR2, which is image stabilized, which basically means that you can shoot a slightly slower shutter speed without getting that motion blur in your photos. This is one of those lenses that I don't have on my camera that much, but when you need it, it's vital. So it's great for wildlife photography, for zooming in on animals so you don't have to get too close. It's great for capturing action in the distance, so if I want to include people in my landscapes, which I quite often do, for example a surfer or maybe a kayaker, this is great for being able to stand in the distance and zoom in on them. It's also great for compression, so sometimes with landscapes what you want to do is compress the background, and you do that by zooming into a photo. You have the foreground interest, the person or the subject closer to you, you zoom in on them and it compresses the background, which basically makes the background look a lot bigger than it is, so you can really accentuate mountains or interesting hills or anything you want to in the background. So these are the three main lenses I would always have with me. Sometimes with landscape photography you can't necessarily take so much equipment with you because of weight or space. For example, if you're hiking up to a peak. In that case, I'd always have my 24-70 with me. It's got enough of a telephoto for me, and it's wide enough, but if it isn't, you can always take a few pictures and stitch them together in Photoshop later. So for me, that's the most vital lens, but I try to have all of these with me if I can on every shoot. A couple of other things I wanted to talk about. Polarizing filter, I always have one with me, and funnily enough, when I first started photography I didn't understand why it was so important, and I thought they looked expensive, but they are really important tools for landscape photography. So it's better to spend a little bit more money because the quality does improve, and what it basically does is it cuts out polarizing light, which is reflected light mainly. So it's vital for shooting any kind of water, whether it be rivers, lakes, ocean. It helps to cut out that glare, and it really brings the rich colour of the water through. A lot of people with landscapes like to use neutral density filters and gradient filters, which basically darken down the sky. For me, I would rather shoot in multiple exposures and blend them together later on, because when you have a gradient filter, it darkens down to one line on the camera, which often darkens down things like mountains or trees as well. It just looks unnatural to me, and I would rather take different exposures and blend them together later, which is why I don't take them with me. Another tool which is great, which I really always have with me, is the Hitman Loupe. These guys are kind of expensive, they're designed for video, but you can get all different types of knockoffs of the similar thing. What it does is you place it on the back of your camera, and it allows you to see the screen clearly even in bright sunlight, so that can be really important to make sure your photo is coming out well if you don't have time to put it on a laptop and check. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is not so much a lens as a whole camera, but I feel like they're so important for landscape photography now, and that is drones. So this is a DJI Phantom 4. DJI are the leaders in the market at the moment. They make various models, but if you're serious about landscape photography, I think they're a very important tool, especially if you want to earn money. They allow you to get a different vantage point that you just couldn't get without a helicopter normally. And actually, they often can get to places that helicopters can't, because they can get to any kind of height. They can squeeze between gaps in valleys or cliffs. Be careful with them, they're a dangerous tool. Make sure you check up on the country's laws before flying them, but they're very affordable nowadays, and I'd highly recommend it. I use it a lot in my work. So if you like this tutorial, guys, please give it a thumbs up. I would greatly appreciate it. I'm going to start doing weekly tutorials, and I'd love to hear from you guys about what you'd like to hear me talk about. So thanks for following along, and I'll see you next week.